Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest of the stories.
What's a horrifying/creepy experience you have lived through?
51. I am realizing I have been through more than I thought. Almost getting abducted as a child, fending off potential home invaders, finding dead animals in weird places, finding live animals in weird places, having a patient predict his own death, and having a professional hypnotist come charlatanize another person's death. The one that affects me the most is my grandfather's death. Not really gruesome, but I'm a nurse and my grandfather were dying of lung cancer. He was my very best friend in the world, and I spent the last 2 weeks of his life bathing, talking, feeding, and spending time with him. He knew he was dying for the first 10 days, was quite lucid. We talked about his life in great detail, even recorded a few things on camera for my daughter. He slowly deteriorated a bit each day as the lack of oxygen started to take its toll. The day before he died, he was very alert, very hungry, and in a good mood. I knew this was a bad sign, having seen several people slowly dying before at work. Many people/animals get this big surge of energy just before dying. The very next time he woke up, he was completely confused, asking questions about completely random things, and thought he was half his age for a while. We gathered around him as he was in his agonal breathing, Mom, Grandma, my aunt, and I, and held him. He kept breathing once every minute and my grandmother told me to tell him to let go, he will listen to you. I did. I told him it was okay, and I would take care of the family, and he didn't have to suffer anymore. That was his last breath. When he died, I lost my best friend and most of my confidence, my pride in myself, and my ability to get excited about anything. It has been a long 3 years, and I still think about him every day. 52. When my ex-husband got clean, I thought everything would be okay. We got a little studio apartment together with our new baby, in some guy's backyard. Red flags everywhere, but I was happy he was on the straight and narrow. This wouldn't last. Before I knew it, I wasn't allowed to have a phone, money, or a job, and especially not come to his work at the corner of the street to use the Wi-Fi. I was not allowed to see my grandma, who lived across the street. Before I knew it, it was a full-blown captive situation where we would fight and come to blows regularly. He tore up the only photo I had at the time of my grandfather, who was my personal hero. He hurt me, and I caught him hurting my infant son. I have an inkling that he even tried to poison him at one point. He split my head open with a remote. He threw glass at me, cutting up my legs. He wouldn't let me clean anything, probably so that I couldn't call for police or CPS to help me. I did call the police once, who made me leave for the night with nowhere to go, at which my proprietor was furious with me. Maybe he didn't have the right permits to have that apartment back there. He wouldn't let me buy groceries, and often my baby would have a bottle made up of boiled apples and potatoes. I hurt myself a lot, and attempted suicide several times that year. I lost my faith, and I was losing my mind, too. It wasn't until after I took my son and what I could carry and hit the streets that I was finally done and free. Homelessness was better than being kept hostage. When I finally got settled, I went through the notebooks and drawings I had kept. Unintelligible, garbled, strange nonsense. What I read and saw really horrified me. My diary was just me justifying staying repeatedly, and logging horrible events as if they weren't any big deal. I can't believe I survived that. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know where he is now, and I don't want to know. I'm so much better mentally now, after loads of therapy to handle the guilt I felt about my son being in that situation, the sleep paralysis, the night terrors, the flashbacks, not knowing when I was asleep or awake, because I would have realistic nightmares where I would kill everyone I loved that seemed to go on for hours. I'm finally happy. I haven't been self-harmed since 2014. I don't dwell, I don't worry. My son is in 1st grade now. He's so tall, and so polite, and so fun. He gets great grades, and he's friendly to everyone he meets. He sees the world in a way I don't, and I love him so much. Maybe he really saved my life all of those times, Because I hung on with a little boy to live for who I am sure would have suffered something horrible without me. I thought I didn't have anyone, but my son was with me the whole time. I've had another kid since then, remarried, everything is as it should have been before. I can honestly say, I'm finally happy.
53. I don't want praise or acknowledgement. Several years ago, I was at home when I smelled an awful smell. I looked around the house and couldn't find anything. I went outside and walked around the house. When I got to the backyard, I saw that an apartment that was across the road was on fire. I ran over and saw that there was a car in the parking spot. Each parking spot has the corresponding apartment number painted on the pavement, so I tried to open the front door. It wouldn't open, so I kicked it open and went inside. The smoke was thick and black. It made my eyes and nose run like someone had turned a faucet on. I got the woman out and, since I saw toys everywhere, I went back in. I heard sirens while I was going in. I tried to check the kitchen and the living room and couldn't find the child. I went upstairs and that's when I lost the ability to take a deep breath. Everything that I touched was hot and I couldn't see very well. Every breath that I tried to take felt like I was breathing pure fire. I crawled around on the bedroom floor until I felt a leg. At this point, I was coughing so hard that I was half vomiting with each breath. I pulled the kid by her leg out to the hallway and then picked her up. At this point, I could see daylight, but there were black holes in my vision that were surrounded by yellow and white flashing rings. My ears were ringing and buzzing so loud that I could only hear my coughing and my heart pounding away. I tried to stand up with the kid in my arms so I could get down the steps, and I made it down the first two. The firefighters say that I fell down the steps, but I don't remember it. I had a broken collarbone and jaw along with very severe smoke inhalation. The doctors at the hospital kept telling me that they weren't sure how I didn't die. And it was all for nothing. The little girl had died of smoke inhalation and her mother had died of a heroin overdose. Near as anyone can tell, the little girl was playing with mommy's rig and caught her comforter on fire with it. I almost died while trying to save a couple dead people. 54. Oh man, I wish I'd seen this earlier so people could hear my story. Anyway. When I was in high school, I stayed out late once for a studying session. I rode the train home and there is a mile walk to my apartment. As I'm walking, I see a tall man in a literal black trench coat. Imagine a scary movie scene. It was pitch black at night with only a few streetlights on. He was behind me, so I just picked up my walking pace. I was a very fast walker. But somehow he was keeping up with my pace. I started to get a bit worried, so I casually reach into my book bag and find a sharp pencil in case anything happens. Then, he notices. And says, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna hurt you. Do you want to be friends? Where do you live?" At that point I'm freaking out. But to play it cool, I just replied, "Up ahead." I approached a crosswalk, and I realized if I kept going, he'd know where I lived. So, I slowed down so he was right behind me, and then I pretended to cross the road in one direction, and as he passed slightly ahead of me, I quickly turned and jaywalked the opposite way. I headed towards a nicely lit taco stand that was nearby and just waited there until he passed. I eventually made my way home through a back route where no one would see me. To this day, I truly wonder what would have happened. I carry pepper spray now to this day. It's been 10 years. 55. Exactly 1 year ago today I was set on fire. I was trying to get rid of branches that I cut off a dead tree I had chopped down. I put them in a burn barrel with some cardboard and set the cardboard on fire. They didn't quite catch, so I had the idea to take a small amount of gasoline, throw it from a cup with a handle at the branches and then throw a piece of lit cardboard from a distance in the barrel. The amount of gas was probably less than a quarter cup. After I tossed the gasoline, I remember 1 second moment before everything went really wrong. I assumed that there was probably an ember that caught fire. To this day, though I have no idea how I got lit on fire, I don't remember any gas splashing on me, but suddenly my shoulder and neck of my hooded shirt was on fire. I was in a total panic and ran away from the burn barrel and tried rolling, but with my shoulder/neck on fire it didn't help. I had to rip off my hooded shirt and then the flannel underneath to stop the fire. This is what saved me from third-degree burns, I was told. All of this probably lasted less than 10 seconds. I went into the house in shock and looked at my face. My eyebrows and lashes were gone, my cheeks had peeling skin, my beard was almost gone, save my face in a way, my eyelids were singed, my lower lip was swelled and crisped, and my right side of my neck was in bad shape. It had turned white. My girlfriend and I rushed to the emergency room, and I didn't even have to wait 30 seconds before I was put into a room. They told me if I had breathing problems in the next 5 to 10 minutes I was going to be intubated, otherwise my airway would close and I would die. If you suffer a facial burn and your trachea gets singed, it will swell and close and there is no way to intubate you. This is when I realized how bad this situation was and I went into shock. Thankfully they didn't intubate me, however I was monitored for a bit and was leaking this yellowish stuff from my burns the whole time, but was in so much shock I didn't feel pain yet. They had to transport me about 200 miles away to a burn trauma center where I was examined. My injuries were second-degree burns to cheeks. Deep second-degree burns to almost my entire right side of my neck and below my beard line, second-degree burn to my lips, look like burned hot dogs. For 2 months I had to do deb writing every day on my burns, which is the most painful and horrible experience I have ever had. I would have nightmares about being on fire. I would have daymars for several months after with thoughts like my entire face being splashed in gasoline and set on fire. I came extremely close to needing a skin graft on my neck, but thankfully it healed with some new type of topical treatment they gave me. A year later my left cheek has a darker area that will probably take years to look normal. My neck surprisingly healed better than my cheek and I have a healthy fear of gasoline. Never, ever use an accelerant to start a fire. Use dry sticks, dryer lint, anything except for gas or oil or the like. I would not wish this on anyone. 56. One of my favorite kid things was feeding the ducks and geese on the canal with a loaf of day-old bread. You'd toss in a few pieces and then suddenly it's this big quacking scrum for the bread. One day I was standing on this low bridge over a canal tossing bread in and the scrum was getting started when one of the ducks made a sound I've never heard before and every single one leaps out of the water for the banks, hunkers down, and is dead silent. A moment later, just under the surface, a dark long shadow, maybe 4 feet long, glides up the middle of the canal. It never broke the surface, so I don't know what it was. Otter? Fish? After it passes, the ducks and geese remain dead still and completely silent for what seems like a long time, and then a couple stand up and plop down into the water and the rest follow. And they're back to quacking up a storm and eating the rest of the bread. I noticed that there's a duck stationed at each end of the flock keeping at least one eye out for predators. I don't know what it was, but it was pretty big and we did not live in an area that naturally had large river predators. 57. I was about 12 or so and was staying over with my mom at my grandfather's place for the weekend. My grandfather, who was in a wheelchair, went to bed and a little later my mom and I retreated to the room we shared with one bed. My mom has always been super sensitive with the TV being on while she slept, so she asked me to shut it off. I was not happy about this because I was not sleepy yet and was paranoid about all that there was to hear while alone awake. I had to basically lay there in the dark with no distraction. So, I'm lying there with my back to my mom and the dark hallway while facing the freshly turned off TV. Maybe 15 to 45 minutes later all of a sudden the hallway light turned on, the light switch sound and all. I could see the hallway from the reflection of the TV screen. No one was there. The light switch is right next to my grandfather's room, so I would have heard his wheelchair while getting out of bed and wheeling it to the bathroom. There was no one there in the hallway. About a minute and a half went by and the light switched back off. I was beyond terrified with no outlet. I was riddled paralyzed because I honestly believed, still do, if you don't make a sound or move it won't come after you. I told my mom about it the next day and she said it was probably my grandfather. I would have at least heard him and his wheelchair riding back to bed. But it wasn't, there was no one in the hallway.
58. I started dating a 16-year-old when I was 12 behind my parents' back. He was almost 7 foot and weighed over 200 pounds. When I was 13, they started leaving me alone when they had things to do. My dad owned all the neighboring houses and knew all our neighbors well, so I was pretty safe. Sitting on my couch at 12 a.m. one night, when no one was home, I saw him staring through my window. He forced himself in and proceeded to choke me till I was blue and beat me for many hours. I never told him my parents were gone, so he had to have been watching my house. My papa was dying of cancer at the time, and my cousin was also diagnosed with cancer the same week he was. The BF told me it was my fault they were dying. At one point, he tried to rip my pants off after throwing me on the bed, but I held on tight enough that he ripped the legs off and gave up. We ended up on the second floor, and I kicked a window out and tried to run, but he grabbed me. I noticed his mom kept calling him and saw her car in the woods near my house. She had driven him there and was calling because she wanted to go home. I finally convinced him we would go to her car and tell her he was staying the night. He told me not to try any funny shit. As soon as we got out the door, adrenaline kicked in, and I ran as fast as I could to her car and tried to jump in. She slammed the door, and I heard the car lock. I remember looking at her as he dragged me back into my house by my hair. I went through the beating for another hour before he finally was done and left. I spent the rest of the night watching YouTube on how to cover bruises with makeup and pulling glass out my feet from running. What scares me most is that a woman would lock the door on a child like that. 59. One night someone tried to break into our house. My kids were asleep, and I was doing laundry. The laundry room is in the back of the house, and I was moving from one side of the house to the other, and I guess somebody saw me through the kitchen window. I was in the living room, which is at the front of the house, and I kept feeling a vibration, thinking one of my kids is out of bed roaming around the room. I went and checked on them. They were asleep, and I kept hearing it, feeling it. They were going from one door to the other. I have a back door in my bedroom and a back door in the laundry room. He is pounding on it, kicking it. It freaked me out, so in a panic, instead of calling 911, I called my husband, and he reminded me we had a gun, but it was in my car, which was in the garage, which was open, so I was kind of freaked out to try to go get it, but decided that it was worth a shot. As soon as I opened my car door and got my gun, this guy comes around the corner of the house right in front of the garage. He didn't see my gun, but he heard it when I cocked it, and he started panicking and trying to tell me that somebody was after him and he was just trying to hide. Well, I guess my husband had called the police officers already because they showed up, me gun in hand pointing it at this guy. He's lucky that the police officer showed up, and he's lucky that I was too scared to actually shoot, because that whole night could have ended differently. Prior to this, I was very against guns in the house, and after this I went out and got my concealed handgun license, and we got another gun that we can have one in the car and one in the house. 60. Not supernatural or horrifying, except in the what could have happened way. Sophomore year of college, and I'm home for Christmas break, so I visit an old high school friend who has an apartment off campus. She went to a local school. Her roomies all went home for break, so it's just us two. We'd been talking for a few hours when a guy from one of her classes knocks on the door and comes in talking about this and that, stays about 30 to 45 minutes. He's annoying, but it's not my place to tell him to leave. He finally leaves when I say I need to leave, as it was around 9 p.m. As I am driving out of the parking lot, I see his car turn around and go back into my friend's parking lot. I got maybe half a block thinking this seems fucked up and turned back and went to her apartment with some excuse that I forgot my gloves. He's there, but immediately takes off now that I'm there. As soon as the door closed, my friend broke down. She was so scared, but didn't know how to tell him no and couldn't figure out how to make him leave. I'm just so glad I saw him go back and didn't ignore my spidey tingles. 61. When my abusive ex started giggling like a little kid while I was crying because he was cheating on me with my best friend. He just giggled and looked at me almost lovingly and said, "I have never felt so loved as I do when you're jealous." This guy had raped me, allowed one of his friends to sexually assault me while he looked on and laughed. He threatened me daily, constantly complained about how stupid and useless I was, and practically used me as a slave and an emotional punching bag. And yet, that one moment is the creepiest thing he ever did. I can't explain how or why. Maybe it's a should have been there situation, but in that moment I knew that he for sure wasn't operating on the same frequency as the rest of us. I felt incredibly unsafe after that because I felt he was capable of things I didn't think possible. I was 19 and he was 30. I had no prior experience with relationships before him, and he was really good at making me think that he was right, and I was wrong at every turn because of age and experience. But my mind screamed run in that moment. Would take a while before I actually got out of that situation because I had no energy for anything, and he had successfully isolated me from my loved ones. But yes, that entire relationship was a dumpster fire, and I will probably never forget how he giggled at my torment. That was horror movie levels of no. 62. This did not happen in the US. Back when I was a kid, one of my uncles threw a family party at a big farmhouse that belonged to a friend of his and had been loaned for the weekend. It was a nice party, and the groundskeeper was a particularly fun dude that everyone seemed to want to hang around with, so he was invited to the party. At one point, he even brought out a pony for us kids to ride around. He lived in a smaller house a few hundred meters away from the main house, but not far. At one moment in the party, the groundskeeper stepped out to go check some electronic stuff he thought he had left on in his home. He never reappeared. I was a kid, so I thought nothing of it. We left shortly. Later that day, my dad gets a call and refuses to speak of the party or tries to evade all conversation about it. As an adult, I later learned that the groundskeeper had a substantial amount of debt with local drug dealers. On the day of the party, they had snuck into his house, and when he came in, they beat him, tortured him, and killed him with several blows from a pickaxe. The corpse was then hung from the ceiling. All this took place a few hundred meters away from a massive family reunion taking place. My uncle discovered it that very night after the party was over, and he went looking for the man. Police said our family reunion's music and noise probably covered up the murder sounds. 63. Many years ago, when I was a student, I went to a nightclub with my best friend to celebrate after some exams. She went through a breakup at that time, and she was looking for a nice hookup. She started to dance around with a group of 3 guys that approached her. She started to kiss one of them more, then she would come to me, give me some details, then leave again to kiss that guy and so on. I saw those guys approaching multiple women. Needless to say, we were around 18 to 19 and they looked 30 plus. I rejected them from the start. I said I'm there with my boyfriend that's a police officer. I invented that. I was single. My friend got so drunk. I tried to keep her by my side. She just wanted to duck those guys. They offered her to go at one dude's apartment for fun, and all she could hope for was a gangbang. It seemed shady, because those guys really looked like they just got out of jail. One had a swastika, Idkauta type, tattooed on his forearm. I smelled things are shady. Also, they just tried to approach multiple, single young women. I remember I called a friend of mine, male, and I asked him to come get us out of there. Those dudes started to corner me too, since they didn't see my boyfriend around. And my drunk friend kept saying I'm a boring and tried to convince me to go fuck with them. In the end, my guy friend arrived. We took my girlfriend out of there by force. She literally said she will call the police on me. I said, okay, but you do it tomorrow. Now you're drunk, you will get raped. She came to my place. We slept a lot. After about 20 hours next day, it was everywhere on the news. 3 girls were raped and murdered in the bathroom of that nightclub. And the faces of the suspects were exactly 2 of the dudes that tried to approach my friend and me. I haven't spoken to my friend much after that because she was kind, mean and careless, but she is aware I saved her life, despite the continuous fights and offenses she had for me when she was drunk. I've never been to a nightclub ever since. 64. I always suffered from night terrors, sleep paralysis, and hypnopompic hallucinations. Every time it happened, I could pin the blame on one of those things. But one day, I forgot the front door key to my parents' house. I rang the doorbell and saw some movement in the hallway, a glass front door. It wasn't spooky. I just thought that it was my niece playing around. That is until my mother walked straight through her, and then my niece turned around with a big smile on her face and vanished. That freaked me out for a while. I couldn't blame that incident on anything to do with sleep. It occurred in the middle of the day. I made sure never to forget the front door key after that experience. I also had a feeling of being followed one time. I put it down to paranoia or something like that. But then there was a dog that barked non-stop at something behind me, although there was nothing there. Even the owner looked puzzled. 65. Summer camp. Probably around 2011 if I had to guess. I would have been probably around 10 to 12 years old. There was a week-long overnight summer camp I went to every summer as a kid. This was a themed camp, so every week would have a different theme and they would build a story that would revolve around daily games, like Hunger Games Week. All the campers would be split into teams and do daily challenges and such. When you went, you would be split up into cabins with around 6 to 8 other kids in your cabin and 2 16 to 20-year-old leaders who would be in charge of your cabin the week. Because this was a co-ed week, we also had a cabin of girls, which we would do our activity with. This year was going normally, like most of the years did up until one day. My group was at the pavilion with the girl cabins. All of a sudden, I see one of the leaders run up to us looking concerned and a little, but scared. He walked over to the other leader and said we had to get back our cabins immediately and go into lockdown. Now at this point in my life, I was terrified of lockdowns and shootings, because this was the Sandy Hook era, and I was in elementary school. So, something bad happening at the camp had already been on my mind the whole week. We quickly returned to the cabin where we were told to sit on our bunks and be quiet, and they locked the cabin. I remember everyone was pretty nervous, including the counselor. Then I heard a group of girls scream. I began to cry because at this point I was convinced that a bad thing was going down outside the cabins. There were no windows that I could look out of at this point either. Eventually, the leader who hadn't stayed in the cabin came back and told us we could come out. He claimed it was all a drill and just a test. I believed him, but had a total meltdown and began yelling and crying in front of the whole camp. Which may seem like an overreaction just reading it, but you have to understand I was a paranoid kid, like overly paranoid, still am. I got it from my dad. So, after a week of being scared of that exact situation, I was made out to believe that it was actually happening. That wasn't the strange/creepy part of the story. This next part is something that comes back to me at night a few times a year, and I think about it. I actually was thinking about it tonight and came on here in hopes that someone posted a relevant question to this, just so I could talk about it. I don't believe it was a drill. A day after another camp walked up to me, he said he didn't blame me for being scared because it wasn't a drill. And that he had talked to people who told him that one of the counselors, I don't remember his name, we'll call him Bob because he had an afro, had attacked the head counselor. A lot of this story is lost because I was so young, but here's some points that makes me think this is believable. The obvious, there definitely some urgency/worry on the counselor's face when he told us to get to the cabin. The scream of the girls, I wasn't able to see what was going on, but I think it's self-explanatory that a group of people screaming would mean there was some shit going on. I had been there many years, and they never had any lockdown drills. Of every year I went, that was the only year with one. Let's talk about Bob. I never saw Bob after that day. All the leaders claimed he had gone back to college. But this would have been like a month before colleges started up again. Also, Bob was the main character of the story for all the games that they were putting on. There's no way they would have made him the main guy if he had planned to leave halfway through. Now, if I'm remembering this right, but I think Bob had started to look visibly sick for the couple days before this incident. This is a strange part, but might have nothing to do with it. But I do remember part of his character was that he would eat a lot of Ricola cough medicine, like a lot. The whole week he was eating these things like Jolly Ranchers. He probably went through like 50 of them. Is that healthy for you? I get this isn't exactly a scary story. But it keeps me up at night a couple times a year. What actually happened that day? Was the rumor true? Did this college-aged kid actually have a breakdown and start attacking people? Was it all just an insane number of coincidences? It's something that I really want closure on, but probably will never get.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.